What is going on, FAU fans? Welcome back to the Inside the Burrow podcast presented by FAU Owl's Nest. I'm joined today by a familiar face in Mike Birdman. Mike, I haven't asked in a few days, or a few episodes. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, man. How are you? I
I'm
see you're
doing
wearing
great.
you're wearing the same hat again.
I know. I only have like 3 hats, and 2 of them I'm too lazy to go find because I think they're both in my car. And it's been raining all day, and I don't really want to get outside in that.
And the Panthers are in the cup, so I guess it's
Yeah, I mean, I can wear it, I think, for another few days, and it's just like weird to just wear the same hat on every single episode.
Go for
Uh,
it.
the man without a hat, right below me on the screen, is Evan. I already forgot the last name. Miyakawa.
That's the opposite. It's Miyakawa.
Miyakawa. Wow,
I was about to correct you, but
It was the double trip. You asked for how to pronounce it, and that
yeah,
made
and
you
then I
get it worse.
immediately forgot. I'm really don't worry, guys. I'm really good.
that
at
was
this.
like a major Homer Simpson moment.
I have a few of those an episode. It feels like. Evan, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good.
We're here to talk about FAU's transfer class because the roster is finally finished. Just a few days ago, adding Ken Evans, not Kevin Evans, completely different person, I'd assume. Guard from Jackson State who won the Player of the Year in. Oh God, I already forgot the conference. Don't worry, guys, I'm really prepared. But obviously, conference or the roster class finalized. Evan, you do a lot of things with analytics, with numbers. Sort of, I guess, best place to start is explain what you do, and I guess sort of how it relates to the transfer portal and college basketball as a whole.
Sure. Yeah. So just kind of a general overview. My background is in statistics and sports analytics. I've grown up a huge college basketball fan my whole life. I got my PhD in statistics from Baylor. And so a couple of years ago, kind of on the side, as a side project initially, I started this basketball analytics website, evanmia.com. And it's kind of just organically grown over the last several years into something that's used by a lot of D1 coaches, as well as people in the media and fans for just analyzing the sport. And so there's a lot of stuff on there that analyzes teams, players, lineups, and in this time of the offseason, my transfer portal projections, transfer class rankings, and all that are used by a lot of people for both coaches for evaluating players, as well as just people who are lovers of college basketball for figuring out how good are these players that we're getting and how does that compare to the people we're losing, and things like that.
And I guess the next best place to start is how do you sort of finalize those rankings? What's, I guess, the very brief process, I'd assume, to not make this an hour long, of sort of how you determine those star rankings and I guess the overall class rankings.
Yeah, it's just throwing darts on a dartboard, basically.
I respect
yeah.
that.
Yeah. So, it comes down starting at the player level. Basically what I'm doing is for every single player who's in the transfer portal, but really under the hood, I'm doing this for every single Division I player who's going to be playing next season. Basically, I'm forming a prediction or a projection of how good they're going to be next season. And the way that I do that is it's based around how valuable a player would be on the offensive and defensive end on a per possession basis for any team that they're a part of, kind of regardless of level of competition, adjusting for all of those different levels of variables, whether you're play for a high major team or a mid or low major team. And so there's a lot of factors that go into that. Some is individual stats, like how good are your points per game, assists per game, shooting percentages, things like that. But there's also some components to just when you're on the floor, how are you influencing your team's performance in terms of how good your team is playing offensively and defensively. And that adjusts a little bit for the strength of all other players on the court. So if you are always guarding the other team's best player, you'll get credit for that. And then there also is a little bit of high school recruiting information used, especially for younger players, because especially for guys who are coming off only just 1 or 2 seasons of college ball, freshman recruiting rankings can sometimes give us a picture of how much unreached potential a guy has. So if you have a freshman who was a really highly regarded 5-star at high school and they were a little disappointing in their freshman season, he'll have a much higher transfer rank than another player who performed similarly but didn't have a high school recruiting profile, because often those players who have a lot of potential as seen by scouts in high school tend to be a lot better or grow quicker in college. So those are some of the general factors that go into then forming each player. There's like one number offensively and one number defensively that forms the projection, and you combine those to get an overall rating. And then basically, once you have all those for players, you can combine them to get transfer class rankings. So I do 2 different things there. One is an incoming transfer class ranking, which basically says compares every single team's incoming transfer class just like what you might see for high school recruiting rankings. But then there's also a overall transfer activity ranking, which basically says how much better or worse did your team get through the portal. So comparing your incoming players and how good they are to how good your outgoing players are. And so you can rank all the teams in the nation that way as well.
That's really cool. So before we get into, FAU and how we did according to your system, how do you actually come up with it? Do you like freehand all this player by player on paper? Or did you develop some kind of software where you just plug in statistics and things from previous seasons? And how do you actually come about those offensive and defensive numbers?
Yeah, well, thankfully I don't have to like watch every single game and write down all the stats on paper. That would be
that'd be
difficult.
terrible.
Yeah, no, it's all automated. I have data sources that I have a computer program that automatically combs through all that data and combines it. I've built a lot of these sort of statistical models and algorithms that are kind of based on past data and seeing, how did this type of player do in the upcoming season based on what we knew about him? And then I can sort of use those historical examples to then form predictions for future players kind of based on who's comparable. And thankfully, it's all very automated. So I don't have to do much work to like gather new names or write down their stats or anything like that.
Awesome. Well, this is going to be, I think, a lot more fun and interesting than I thought it would be prior to us starting here. So
awesome. I think there's probably no better place to start than talking about what FAU lost. I guess to sort of paint the picture. And obviously, I think we can all agree that last year's team was filled with high major talent, and obviously the transfer portal proved that with Vlad Golden going to Michigan, John L. Davis going to Arkansas. So I guess how much did FAU truly lose in terms of your rankings, and sort of who were some of the bigger names that they lost? I mean, obviously, I think we know the names, but how did they rank in terms of the entire portal class?
And just mind you, we lost all but one player.
Yeah,
and then of course 2 redshirt freshmen and whatever. But we lost all our depth.
Yeah,
basically.
I mean, basically, the best way to put this in perspective is to cite Florida Atlantic's overall transfer activity ranking, which basically says how much did you gain or lose to the portal. And in that sense, they're 355th in the country out of 363 teams. So top 10 in the country in terms of losing a lot to the portal. Now, that's not necessarily FAU's fault. I mean, like, they had an overachieving team the last 2 seasons that went to much greater heights than anyone expected. And then your head coach leaves and takes a couple players with him, and the rest of the players want to pursue better opportunities because they've earned it. So that's not really FAU's fault at all. But yes, you've lost Vlad Golden, who I had as a top 10 transfer. John L. Davis, who is regarded by many to be potentially the best transfer in the entire country, if not in the top 5. I have him a little bit lower, but still one of the best transfers in the country. Elijah Martin's off to Florida, and he was an amazing player. And even a player like Nick Boyd, who's going to San Diego State, I mean, he's been a key piece for them the last couple of years. And, those are just your top 4 that you lost. So there's a lot to replace there, and you're certainly not going to be able to replace that like for like with a new head coach and all that. So, definitely a tough place for FAU to start an offseason, no question. But, the flip side of that is the notoriety that your program has gained the last couple of years hopefully allows you to be a step higher than what you would be in this situation with a new head coach without all of the success that program has had the last couple of years.
Cool. I keep saying it, like, if we didn't have that success we had the last 2 years, we wouldn't have been able to make a hire like John Jacobs for sure, right? Guy is, I mean, I've known him for a couple months now, and I regard his basketball knowledge is next level, and I don't know what to say about it. It's insane that we're even having this conversation. Like, we went from Dusty May, who was essentially no-name coach 5-6 years ago, and I love Dusty. This is not a knock on Dusty, but we're able to now kind of like have such a jump start on we call it reload here, on reloading, our roster. And I don't know. So what do you think? What do you think of the coaching hire? What do you think of that? Like,
yeah, I love it. I mean, I'm a Baylor guy. I was, at Baylor. Great. I was at Baylor when they won their national championship. And so, and we've seen the success that the Scott Drew coaching tree has had across the country. It's one of the biggest, most successful coaching trees of any coach in the country. And so I think John Jacobs is a great hire for FAU. I think, has been, and it was in line for a big time job for a bit now. And kind of to your point, Mike, like, if you compare the reputation of Dusty May when FAU got him compared to the reputation of John Jacobs. Obviously Dusty May is now considered one of the rising coaches in the country,
Right.
but just on paper at the time of hire, like John Jacobs is the most exciting hire that FAU has had. And
Absolutely.
that is a sign of the program growing and exceeding expectations and kind of, raising its level year over year, even if you lost your head coach and a lot of your best players. Like long-term, big picture, this is a massive win in the long haul.
I guess I sort of want to follow this up, and I'm not sure how you can answer this, but when a team loses, I guess as much as FAU did, how difficult is it for them to then replace that talent in terms of your rankings? I mean, do we see teams that rank near the bottom of transfer activity rise back to the top quickly, or is that still sort of a process that takes time, I guess, since you've been doing this?
Yeah, the tough part, there's a couple factors to this. One is the amount of teams like FAU that we've seen lose pretty much their entire roster and get gutted in one offseason. This is kind of unprecedented in terms of what we've seen this offseason from teams like FAU. I mean, you could cite, other, bigger programs like Louisville and Kentucky as examples of teams that pretty much lost their entire roster and have a new head coach and have to rebuild from scratch. We've not really seen anything like this. So there's not a ton of data yet to say, like, how good did these teams fare when they have a completely gutted roster? But just in general, I think one of the challenges for FAU is that, while the transfer portal does give you the opportunity to have a lot of different options in terms of how to refill your spots, FAU does not have the type of resources like a Louisville or Kentucky to fill it in the same way, or certainly, replace like for like of what they lost in the portal. And so in that sense, they are a little bit constrained in terms of what you can do. And so I do think it's more appropriate to probably think of this as a, hopefully a one step towards a multi-year build towards something sustainable, as opposed to expecting a program like FAU with a new head coach to immediately just like be as good as they were last year. That's not going to happen. So in that sense, I think you have to kind of, lower expectations a little bit just in terms of what you're able to do. But I certainly think that the work that they're doing in the portal is a good step in the right direction long term.
I know we can't compare ourselves, especially with the new NIL and everything, to the Power 5 schools, right? But as far as NIL goes in the American Conference, we're at the top along with Memphis. They have obviously that huge donation from FedEx, which is like unprecedented and going to help them a lot across all sports, right? But FAU has done really, really well raising money for NIL. And I think we're gonna see that pay dividends this season compared to what most of the other American teams are doing. There's some teams in the American, from what I'm to understand, and I don't look too deep into like what UTSA is doing or Rice. I really don't care, to be honest with you. But from what I hear, they are like struggling big time with NIL, especially for basketball, right? So going into this year, how do you think we did, and how do you think Coach Jacobs and his staff did with trying to reload as successfully as possible?
Yeah, I would say they did a fairly good job. If you accept the fact that you lost the guys that you lost, that was going to happen, right? Their incoming transfer class is 72nd in the country, which is really solid, especially for a team that's not, from the traditional high major ranks.
Yeah.
And, it's also when you have a new head coach who doesn't already have a track record as a head coach, that's a little bit harder to sell to some players. So the fact that they are able to have a incoming transfer class ranked inside the top 75 in the country, I think is really solid. And so, yeah, I mean, obviously I think the hard part is that whatever you do, you're going to have a bunch of new players, new faces, and a new coach. So it's, I feel like the ceiling is really high, the floor is really low, just because you don't know exactly what you're going to get this first season. There could be some growing pains, or they could hit it out of the park and be great in year one. You really don't know. But I think just from a talent amassing perspective, I think they've done a fairly good job.
Who was the highest ranked player on your rankings that FAU acquired? And I guess where did they rank nationally, and sort of what stood out about them with the numbers that you had available?
Sure. So the highest ranked transfer that I had coming in for FAU was Baba Miller from Florida State. I had him ranked in the top. He's 129th in the country amongst about 2,000 transfers. And the thing that part of why he's rated so highly, according to my model, is because, yes, he was fairly successful for Florida State. He had, some pretty decent numbers, 7 points, 5 rebounds, a block and a steal per game, efficient from two, and he can shoot the three a little bit. But as I mentioned before, part of the process of making these projections is also trying to figure out a guy's potential. And he's a highly athletic 6'11", almost 7-footer who is a 4-star high school prospect. And so part of what my statistical model basically predicts for him is that he has even more potential that has not been reached yet. And so when you combine his relatively solid numbers at Florida State, along with his kind of profile coming out of high school and that athleticism that he has, he's predicted to have by far his best season and hopefully multiple seasons at FAU. And so that's part of why he rates so highly. And part of that is actually because his defensive grade on a per possession basis, he's ranked really well, and he should have a major factor on that end of the floor. And that's something that's typically a little bit underappreciated in the transfer portal is defense. I mean, it's a lot easier to tell who's good offensively than defensively, but when you're using a database tool like mine, we actually have the numbers to be able to put defensive grades on guys, and so sometimes a guy who's rated highly will often be because of the defensive impact that they're supposed to have, and so that can sometimes be underrated by other people. But I'm certainly impressed with him.
I guess following that up, there are some players that are ranked a little bit lower on your board compared to, some of the bigger sites, the 24/7s, the On3s, the rivals. And I think the names that really stand out to me is Leland Walker, the guard from Eastern Kentucky, and more recently Ken Evans, because they're both, for the most part, consensus 4 stars on those boards. And I think they come in as 3 stars on yours.
Who was the other one? There was one more. Was it Caleb Glenn?
I think it was Kai. I think it was Kai, who was a little bit lower. But sort of, why do they rank lower? Is it a defensive thing? Is it impact? Like, is there something holding them back from being, I guess, the typical 4-star on your rankings?
Sure. So yeah, I don't know a ton about how those other sites are, like the number of players they designate to 5-star, 4-star, 3-star compared to what I'm doing. So I can't speak to that for sure. But in general, one general trait that I see for those guys is that all of them are scored the ball at a really good rate, and were so I mean that's their main trait is scoring. So like Ken Evans, for example. He's had a really impressive career progression at Jackson State. He averaged like 5 points per game as a freshman, and then it went up to 8, and then 11. Then last year, like almost 19 points per game, which is really impressive. And most of those guys are also fairly good from 3 as well, which is really useful. The thing for Kevin Evans that's kind of holding him back a little bit is, number one, his 2-point shooting is not that efficient. He only makes a little over 40% on his 2-point shots, and he takes a lot of those. And so that's certainly something that can be improved there. He turns the ball over a lot. And then the other thing too, and you'll see this as a common theme across those names you mentioned, is that his defensive grade is not very good. Coming from a team that wasn't that great defensively, and he didn't grade out that well amongst his fellow teammates, whether it's in terms of looking at his defensive contributions on a statistical side, like, rebounds, blocks, steals, or just how well the team performed defensively while he was on the floor. I gave him I think a C- grade amongst all players in the portal for defense. And that's actually the same for both Kai Tandy and Leland Walker. They all have C- grades defensively. And so when you look at why their ranking is pulled down, it's not so much the offensive end, it's really more of the defensive end that's making them slightly less regarded amongst all other transfer portal players. So if you were to rank them just by offense, I think they would be a little bit higher there.
Well, I hope we get some of the coaches watching this, because this is good information. This is good statistical stuff for sure.
So I guess the follow-up on that is this sort of a situation where it's sort of imperative to understand roles? I mean, obviously your numbers don't understand that player X or player Y was brought in to be the offensive scorer, but in the case of FAU, right, like they brought in those 3 guys to score the ball, and is that sort of a situation where it's weighing that and then understanding that you have to sort of take the hits defensively when they come for some of these guys?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way of putting it. Like you said, I have no way of knowing what a coach is planning on doing with a player or how they're planning on using them in a scheme. So I can't account for that in these transfer portal projections. And if I know where a player is going to school, I don't tweak the number on them at all based on where they're going. So in that sense, like for any of these players, you can make the argument that like, oh, well, we're planning on hiding his defensive weakness by doing X, Y, or Z. And so he'll be a better player than that. And you could say that for probably any player in the portal, to be honest. So, I can't account for that. And so there's, it's very possible that the coaching staff is well aware of these things and they have a plan for doing that. And it's just kind of all part of the master plan here. So, I do think though, in general that, by and large, if you are bringing in a player to score, and scoring is the most coveted thing in the portal. It's the thing that a lot of people think is the most translatable skill, and a lot of times it is. If you have a player who scores over 15 points per game, really pretty much anywhere, you can pretty much count on them scoring at least 10 points per game at the high major level. Now, what really comes along with that, though, is, how efficient are they going to be scoring the ball, and are they going to be able to contribute to the team in other ways, like making plays for other teammates, or being good defensively, those sorts of things can often be question marks. And so, there's a lot more to the game than just scoring. Obviously, scoring is the most important part of the game. And so if a coaching staff is able to lock one attribute down, you'd like to have good scores. So I don't blame anyone for chasing players like that.
It's really interesting because I remember Jacobs when he got here and he was talking about recruiting, and he really put the statistical data into their their strategy for finding players, right? We've all seen, I don't know if we've all seen it, but that movie Moneyball, right, with Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill. They bought the best players they could with the money they had based on the statistics, right? So they were looking at different things than what the typical teams were looking at. And I know when our staff was looking at players, one of the things they were looking at was, of course, how many points per game and how these players were producing and trying to get the best bang for the buck, because we unfortunately couldn't go out and buy John L. Davis, right, or Vlad Golden, and it stinks talking about that in college, but unfortunately, that's kind of like where we're at now. We're buying players and buying hopefully wins. I think I don't like it, but that's kind of what we're dealing with now. But yeah, I just find it super interesting how like this all kind of goes together now. Like you having you on the podcast with us kind of puts it in full circle now. It's kind of cool.
So I guess, following that up, who was the best offensive player by your grades, right? I mean, because we talked about the offense and you had mentioned some of these guys' defensive grades. So who were, I assume it's probably one of those three, but who was the best offensive player that they got and sort of what stood out about them?
Yeah, it's Leland Walker, the point guard from Eastern Kentucky. And the thing I like about him is that he can score. He averaged over 15 points per game, but he also sets the table for others. He had 4 assists per game, which is pretty good for a point guard. And he limited turnovers. He's a fairly good 3-point shooter. He's also good from 2. So when you have a player who not only can score the ball, but can also facilitate, especially when you're bringing in other scorers like Tandy and Evans, you want a guy at the point who's going to be able to facilitate for them. But the nice thing about Walker is that, he's not just a pass first guy. He can score it on his own if you need. So I really like the balance that he brings. The other part about it is that, looking at the advanced numbers, Eastern Kentucky played really well when he was on the floor. So their offensive level was improved or elevated, which points to that type of impact that he'll be able to have at FAU as well. So of those transfer portal guys, he's the one with the highest offensive grade.
Now, we brought in a lot of international players. How does your system work with the international talent? You don't have a lot of data coming from colleges, right? Like Max coming from the German level 2 division basketball and Montes and Matis coming from Lithuania.
Yeah.
Yeah. How does that factor? How do you get grades for them?
Sure. That's the toughest group of players, to be honest. So if you have an international player who's coming and he's not played college ball before, that's the hardest projection to get for any of those players. So I'm able to still find some recruiting services who rank them in some way, or if there's an important player last year, Aid Zvonimir Avicic for Kentucky, who kind of committed late, and there weren't really a lot of services who were ranking him exactly. I kind of just eyeballed how people were comparing him to other freshmen, and it just sort of formed a general, I think here's roughly where he would be rated based on what I'm seeing. But again, that's a kind of a hand wavy approach. And the thing with that is for freshmen and also international prospects, one of the things is, even though every player has a projection or a starting point for where they start their season in terms of their rating. For those freshmen, those international players, the uncertainty attached to that is much wider. So basically, the model is able to learn a lot quicker about how good or bad a player is if they're a freshman because we have no data on them. Whereas if you have a fifth-year player who's at the same team that they were at last year, we're typically a lot more confident in knowing exactly how good that player is. And so there's a lot more sort of trust in that preseason projection for that player. Whereas for a freshman or an international player, there's a lot more wiggle room. And so that's why, like a Reed Shepherd, who is not considered to be the best freshman in his class, quickly became graded out as the best freshman in college basketball last year because it became obvious that he was rated too low according to the recruiting services, at least in terms of what his college production would be.
And then, we talked a lot about the guys at the top of that list, but is there someone, I guess, lower on FAU's rankings that stands out to you as someone who can either outplay that ranking or should be talked about more in terms of the grand scheme of their roster construction?
I don't necessarily know if I have an answer to that exact question. I am really intrigued by Kai Tandy, though, because, number one, it's his 6th season of college basketball, which in today's day and age, having a player who's in their 5th or 6th year, in his case, playing against other players who might be 18 years old can be a huge, huge factor in terms of the experience, the maturity, the physicality, the mentality. And we're not going to see this very much more often because after this year, we're not going to have players playing a 5th year in college due to the extra COVID year. So I'm really curious to see how he does. He spent 4 years at Xavier before, and it was, kind of his career progression there wasn't super great. But then he went to Jacksonville State last year and averaged close to 20 points per game. So it's kind of hard to say exactly how good he is because he's had 2 very different experiences the last 2 years. So I think he's a little bit of a wild card there, but a wild card that I like, especially if you're trying to, build a team from scratch. He's got some high major experience, and then he was, arguably had a, big jump in terms of, talent progression last year. So I'm interested to see what he does for sure.
Was that a dog?
Yes, my dog has joined our podcast.
All right.
I love it. I love it.
All dogs are welcome here.
I guess then let's look at the entire conference, right? And the entire American, because there was a lot of movement in the American in terms of teams losing talent and teams gaining talent. I guess sort of where does FAU stand in terms of the entire conference and their outlook in terms of, I guess, competing in that conference with what they brought in?
Yeah, so in terms of the conference, their incoming transfer class ranks 2nd behind Memphis, which is great. And again, that's kind of another signal of the fact that, I might not expect that FAU would be quite that highly rated when you lose all your players and have a new head coach. So again, that's impressive in its own right. So Memphis, though, has done a lot of really good work in the portal. The interesting thing with Memphis is that this was kind of a similar story last season, right?
They had debate that.
My numbers like it. Now, here's the thing, though. They had a highly regarded transfer class last year,
right?
But almost their entire team last year was made up of newcomers, be that freshmen or transfers, and they kind of flopped towards the end of the season. And so now the Memphis fan base and people at large are not necessarily convinced that just getting talented players in the offseason is going to mean that Memphis is going to have a successful season. So I think the expectations there are a little bit more tempered, which is part of why maybe we haven't heard quite as much fanfare about their incoming transfer class, even though my data really likes what they've done. So, with all of this, having a highly ranked transfer class means nothing if you can't put it together on the court. So at the end of the day, that's really what matters most.
I want to ask one more question about, I guess, guys like Caleb Glenn, who played at a Louisville team last year that was bad, right? Like, there's probably no other way to say it. Like,
when you have a good player in a weird situation.
Yeah,
right?
like, so when you have a guy who has the talent that Caleb Glenn had, who was a top, I think, 100 or top 150 player by most recruiting services, but had a bad situation, how much does team success weigh in on that? And is there a way that you sort of try and remove the guys who were on bad teams and couldn't impact the game as much because I guess everything was going wrong there?
I want to add to that too. And does it make a difference when you're going from a Power 5 team down to a conference like the American or Conference USA or something like that? How does that affect the rating of the player having less competition?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of different aspects there. Generally speaking, a player who played in a a high major conference is going to be more highly rated than a player who played in a low major conference, just because of the strength of competition that you're facing there. The other part too is for Louisville. I mean, they were very bad last year, and their whole roster kind of all underperformed expectations. So a lot of it for a player like Caleb Glenn is, he didn't play very much last year, but in the limited minutes that he played, the signs were promising. And the other thing is that he's young and he was highly regarded out of high school. So he's actually rated pretty highly, on my site. And part of that, or a lot of that, has to do with, again, this sort of untapped potential that's supposedly there. And so, even recognizing that he came from a bad team last year, I think if Louisville had been better and if he had played more, he would be ranked higher than he is now. But I think even just by the data that's there, my sort of algorithm recognizes that, there could be a lot more there than what he was able to do in kind of one season in a limited role on a bad team. And so there's definitely a lot more promise there for him.
Mike, you got anything else? Because I think we sort of touched on everything I had.
This was really, really interesting, and I'm sure we could keep talking about this kind of stuff for hours, because I got all. I want to go down a different rabbit hole, but it's not for today. But I see what's this background you got here? What's all this coffee? These coffee labels? What is all that?
Yeah, it's coffee. So I collect specialty coffee from roasters all over the country and put them on my wall just for you guys.
Did you drink? Did you try? Obviously, you tried.
Yes,
them all, right?
I've drank all of these.
Which ones you ranked them all?
Yeah, I have a master spreadsheet. Is that some?
Yeah, which is your favorite one up there?
Oh boy. Let's see. I don't know if I could
sticks out to me.
Yeah, let's see. Where's that one? I'm trying to think. This one here, Atomic Coffee Roasters. I've had several from them. They're really good. This one up here, it's called Wizard Cat. Also very good.
Where's that from?
The coffee is from. I'm trying to remember. I think it's from Honduras.
Honduras, cool, man.
Yeah.
So Evan, what you don't know is in my kitchen, which is probably about 100 steps that way, I have an espresso machine, I have an AeroPress, got about 4 different kinds of coffees. So you're sort of speaking my language here.
Literally before we got on this call, with my Kalita Wave pour over, I just made myself a nice cup of coffee from Tanzania.
I will probably go make one immediately after this. Let's be clear.
Yeah.
So I guess probably no better place to go then. Are you a light roast, medium roast, or dark roast guy? Like, which one do you prefer? Because I guess that's the most decisive question.
Yeah, sure.
Anyone has.
I think I'm kind of in the light medium range. Like I really like light roasted coffees, but sometimes I like a little bit more of a medium to kind of bring out some of the more traditional coffee flavors. That's typically the profile I find myself enjoying the most.
Awesome.
All right.
Before we go, let's take the statistics out of it for a second. Where do you think FAU ends up at the end of the year in conference play?
If we take out the statistics, I have no idea.
What does your gut say? How about that? You gotta have a gut. Put the math away for a second.
My gut tells me probably mid to upper echelon, like upper mid echelon of the conference.
So top 5, something like that.
Yeah, fifth sounds about right to me.
5th, okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll let's touch base at the end of the season and.
Yeah,
I want to
we'll
update
see where we all stand on this.
Yeah, here's
sample size.
Here's the thing, Mike. Whenever I talk to people, especially who don't have the background that I do, my number one goal is that they'll say, that's actually kind of interesting, which is what you said today. So I've achieved my goal today.
No, it was really interesting. I like how much we brought up Louisville also, because we actually had Pat Kelsey was actually at our arena this last year. We played Charleston at home.
That's right.
That dude is a maniac.
He really is.
He's a real maniac, and him and Dusty kind of got on it. And one of the best things I've ever seen was Dusty turning around to him. I was standing like 15 feet away, and Dusty turns around because he was just barking at Dusty. Blah, 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 blah. This your player, this, that. Dusty just turns around and goes, "Don't talk to me." And walks away from him.
That was arguably the funniest game I've ever seen live.
It was amazing. That was an amazing time. Dog walking them out of our gym. So
Evan, I want to give you an opportunity to, I guess, just plug your stuff. Where can people find you and sort of where's the best place to follow your work?
Sure. Yeah. So the best place to follow my work is definitely my website, evanmia.com. It's got pretty much everything on there: player ratings, team ratings, lineup stuff, transfer portal, all that good stuff. Links to all of my socials are on there as well. I use Twitter a lot. That's probably my main platform, but I'm on a couple others as well. I've got a blog where I put out from time to time some sort of interesting statistical analyses. I've got a study coming out probably at the beginning of next week on the magic formula to constructing rosters in the modern portal era. Really excited about that research, so you can find that over on my blog. Yeah, I think that covers it.
I do want to take one more chance to get your name right, because I feel sort of bad about asking for your name before we started and then immediately saying Miyakawa as if I knew what I was talking about.
You're supposed to be a pro, Kevin.
I know.
I'm the amateur. You're the pro.
Pro is a very strong word to explain me, Mike. Let's be clear. Evan Miyakawa, thank you for joining us, and I can tell that I got it right this time, so at least I can go to bed happy doing that. Evan, man, thanks for joining us a bunch. We appreciate it.
Evan, we
Absolutely.
appreciate you so much, man.
Yep.